The first time she saw him, she thought he was harmless, just another face in the crowd. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That feeling would haunt her for the rest of her life. The campus of Westbrook University stood in quiet solitude, a slight breeze swaying the trees around the library as the last of the students scurried to their dorms, their footsteps echoing down the cobbled paths. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening. The sun had long set, casting shadows across the academic buildings, and the cold bite of night began to seep through the air. Students, as usual, were busy cramming for exams, typing away on laptops, or discussing assignments. There was nothing unusual about the night. Or so it seemed. Emily Harris, a dedicated psychology student, walked briskly across the quad towards the library, her bag slung over her shoulder. She had always been the type to focus on her studies, often losing track of time during late-night study sessions. Her friends had often teased her for being the bookworm, but Emily didn't mind. It gave her a sense of purpose, and it kept her grounded in a way that nothing else could. The quiet of the library, the scent of old books, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights gave her a strange comfort. But tonight, something felt off. As Emily crossed the quad, her eyes scanned the surroundings, picking out the usual landmarks, the fountain, the old oak tree near the library, the bench she often sat on during the day. It was dark, but the night was peaceful, and there were only a few scattered students making their way home. Still, there was an uneasy sensation crawling up her spine. She paused briefly to glance around. Nothing out of the ordinary, she thought, shaking her head as if to shake off the unease. She continued walking, her steps growing faster. That was when she first saw him. He was standing by the library's side entrance, near the shadows of a row of trees. At first glance, he seemed harmless, just a tall figure, casually leaning against the wall, his hands in his pockets. His posture was relaxed, even nonchalant. His features weren't particularly striking, but there was something about the way he stood there, staring at the ground, that made Emily feel like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Emily pushed the unsettling thought aside. It's just a guy, probably waiting for someone, she reassured herself. She had no reason to be afraid. And yet, as she neared the door, she caught the faintest glint of his eyes as they flicked up to meet hers. For a brief moment, she felt a sharp, prickling sensation crawl down her neck. His gaze was cold, too cold for a passing glance. It felt predatory, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Get a grip, Emily," she whispered under her breath, shaking her head again. She couldn't let her mind run wild. She pushed the door open and stepped inside the warm, familiar embrace of the library. The comfort of the fluorescent lights and the smell of paper and ink grounded her. It was here, among the quiet study tables and the hum of soft conversations, that Emily felt safe. She picked a secluded corner, just far enough away from the main aisles but still within sight of the entrance, where she could lose herself in her books. What she didn't know, however, was that the moment she had stepped inside, Jason Morgan had followed her. Jason stood just outside the library, watching through the glass windows. His tall, lean frame was now completely concealed in the shadowed corner, but his eyes never left Emily. His lips twisted into a faint, unsettling smile. This moment, he knew, was the beginning of something bigger than anything he had ever imagined. He wasn't just watching her, he was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect time to strike. Jason had always been good at waiting. Good at hiding in plain sight. To anyone who looked at him, he was just another student on the campus, maybe a little reserved, a little odd, but nothing more. No one ever suspected the darkness that simmered just beneath the surface. It had taken years of practice, years of hiding his true nature, but tonight, everything was falling into place. He had seen her before. The girl with the blonde ponytail and the bright eyes, sitting alone in the library, focused and intent on her books. She had seemed perfect. The ideal victim. Jason's heart quickened at the thought. His palms grew sweaty as he stepped back into the shadows. He wasn't nervous. No, this wasn't fear, it was excitement. The thrill of knowing what was about to happen next. Emily hadn't noticed him follow her inside. She hadn't noticed that he had been watching her for weeks now, learning her habits, her patterns. She never suspected anything when she picked her corner in the library, spread out her notes, and began to study. Her world was small, safe, contained. But Jason had been watching, planning, waiting for the moment when the two of them would finally meet. Hours passed as Emily immersed herself in her textbooks, lost in the quiet rhythm of her work. The library grew emptier as the night deepened, until it was nearly silent, save for the sound of the occasional turning page or the tapping of a keyboard. But there, in the corner, Jason waited. He had been patient enough to let her focus, to let her feel safe. He didn't want her to feel threatened, yet. Finally, he walked toward her, slow and steady. Emily didn't see him approach until he was standing right beside her table. "Hey," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "You're Emily, right?" Startled, she looked up. Jason was standing there, his expression almost too neutral. He was slightly taller than her, with sharp features and messy brown hair. He seemed vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place where she had seen him before. Yeah, I am," she replied, still a bit thrown off by the sudden appearance. "Do I know you?" "I don't think so," he said with a shrug. "I'm Jason, from the history class. I noticed you were studying for the psych exam, and I could use a little help. I've been trying to get through these readings, but it's been tough. Thought you might know something." Emily hesitated for a moment. Her first instinct was to tell him she was too busy. She had so much to cover herself. But something in his voice, something about the way he stood so close, his presence invading her personal space, made her think twice. "Sure, I could help with that," she said, reluctantly closing her textbook. "What do you need help with?" Jason's smile grew. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down her spine. He slid into the chair opposite her, setting down his books. He seemed too comfortable, too eager. The conversation began innocuously enough, talking about their assignments, the stress of the upcoming exams, but Emily couldn't ignore the feeling that Jason was studying her as much as she was helping him. His questions weren't entirely about the material. They were probing. Personal. He asked about her plans after graduation, her hobbies, even her relationships. Emily found herself getting more uncomfortable with each question. She tried to deflect, focusing on the work in front of her, but Jason's probing continued. And then, before she realized it, he was leaning closer, his breath brushing her face as he stared at her with unnerving intensity. She recoiled instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're getting a little too close," she said, her voice shaky. Jason didn't back away. Instead, he smiled again, a slow, predatory smile. "Sorry. Just wanted to make sure you're okay. We're all alone here, aren't we?" It was then that Emily realized something was terribly wrong. Something had shifted. He wasn't just here for help with his studies. He wasn't just some random guy looking for a study partner. He was here for her. Have you ever had a moment where you felt like something was off, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it? Drop a comment below with your experiences, and if you're intrigued by this chilling story, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. What was supposed to be a simple study session was about to become something much darker. Emily's nightmare was only beginning. But how could she escape? She thought it was just a bad feeling. But what if it was more than that? What if it was instinct warning her of the danger lurking just behind the shelves? Emily's mind raced as she tried to steady her breathing. Jason had leaned too close. The air between them felt thick, suffocating, and she could taste the tension, the fear, rising in her throat. He had made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain, more than just socially awkward. There was something off about the way he looked at her, the way he lingered a second too long after she'd spoken, the casual touch of his fingers on the edge of her book as he pushed it aside. I need to use the restroom," Emily said suddenly, her voice shaking slightly as she stood up, trying to put as much space between them as possible. "I'll be right back." Jason didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, a coldness in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Then, as if he had just realized she was leaving, he smiled. "Sure," he said, his voice low and calm. "Take your time." The way he said it made her skin crawl. Emily hurried towards the bathroom, her heart pounding. Her mind tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was I overreacting? Was I being paranoid? She washed her face quickly in the cold water, trying to push the unease out of her mind. It wasn't as if he had done anything threatening, not exactly. But there was something in his gaze, in his demeanor, that had felt wrong. The sensation of being watched stayed with her as she made her way back to the library. She lingered by the restroom door for a moment, glancing nervously down the hallway. No sign of Jason. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. But as soon as she stepped back into the library, the tension returned. There he was again, sitting exactly where he had been, as if nothing had happened. He was absorbed in a book, but Emily could feel his presence, as though the whole library were just a stage and they were the only two players in this chilling performance. Trying to act natural, she returned to her table, placing her things back down on the surface. She attempted to refocus on her textbooks, but the words blurred in front of her eyes. Every sound seemed amplified, each click of a keyboard, each rustle of paper, even her own breathing seemed louder. The sense of dread she'd felt earlier settled back into her chest like a heavy stone. Jason wasn't reading anymore. He was watching her. His eyes never left her face. His gaze, cold and unblinking, drilled into her. And though he appeared calm, almost bored even, Emily could feel the weight of his attention on her like a looming shadow. Just ignore him, Emily, she thought to herself. He's not dangerous. He's just awkward. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. She shifted in her chair, trying to concentrate on the page in front of her, but it was no use. Her mind kept returning to Jason. She could feel his eyes on her. He was still watching. Then, without warning, Jason stood up. The sudden movement made Emily look up from her book. She didn't want to acknowledge him, didn't want to acknowledge what had been creeping into her mind for the past few minutes. But her eyes betrayed her, and for the briefest second, their gazes locked. Jason's smile was slow and deliberate, and his eyes gleamed with something she couldn't quite place. The look sent a chill down her spine, the smile far too calculated, too deliberate. "I've been thinking," Jason said casually, breaking the silence between them. His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper, but sharp with something hidden beneath. "You've been working so hard. Don't you ever take a break?" Emily frowned, her discomfort mounting. I guess not. I'm kind of focused right now." "I understand," he said, nodding slowly. "But I'm sure you could use a break. It's not good to study for so long without relaxing. You wouldn't want to burn yourself out before your exam, would you?" His tone was soft, almost friendly, but there was an underlying tension to his words. It was as though he wasn't trying to have a normal conversation with her, but trying to control the situation, steer her toward something else. Toward him. Emily opened her mouth to respond, to tell him that she just wanted to focus, but the words caught in her throat. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke. His calm, measured voice felt almost hypnotic, like he was subtly coercing her to follow his lead. She didn't want to fall for it, but she didn't know how to refuse without seeming rude. No. She had to be firm. She had to stand her ground. "I really don't need a break," Emily said, forcing her voice to sound confident. She gave him a tight smile. "Thanks, but I'm okay." For a moment, Jason just stood there, silent. His eyes never left hers. He took a small step forward, and she instinctively recoiled. "Okay," Jason said, but there was an edge to his voice now, an impatience that hadn't been there before. "If that's what you want." Emily's heart skipped a beat as Jason turned abruptly, walking away from her table without another word. His steps echoed through the empty library, each one growing fainter, but the weight of his presence lingered. She felt the tension in her body slowly begin to relax as she watched him leave. For a brief moment, she thought he was gone for good. But then, just as she was about to breathe a sigh of relief, she heard something, footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the far side of the library. It was Jason again. But this time, he wasn't alone. A small, anxious voice in the back of her mind screamed at her to leave, to run. But Emily didn't move. She stayed seated, frozen in place. Jason was coming back, and this time, there was something different in his eyes. He wasn't walking toward her. He was walking straight toward the back door of the library, where the security exit was located. And as Emily watched him, a cold realization crept over her. He wasn't leaving. He was simply positioning himself. He was waiting for something, or someone, to take the bait. What do you think Jason's game is? Was he just trying to get under Emily's skin, or is there something much darker at play here? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chilling chapter in this twisted tale. Trust me, the truth is more disturbing than you could ever imagine. Emily wasn't just being paranoid. She was about to find out just how dangerous Jason really was. But would she be able to escape before it was too late? When Emily's body is found, the police are baffled. Was it a robbery gone wrong, or was something more sinister at play? The early morning fog clung to the campus of Westbrook University, blanketing the grounds in a thick, gray mist. The sun had just begun to rise, casting an eerie, almost unnatural light across the quad. The usual bustle of students heading to early classes was absent. Only the low murmur of distant voices and the rustling of leaves disturbed the silence. The campus, usually filled with the vibrant energy of youth, felt hollow, empty. Emily Harris was dead. And with her death, the quiet morning became the beginning of a long, brutal investigation that would uncover the darkest depths of the human mind. It started with a phone call. Officer Dan Holt had been on duty since midnight, barely awake and sipping his stale coffee as he leaned against his cruiser. The call came through just before sunrise. A body had been discovered in the university library. The woman had been found by the night shift janitor, who had noticed a strange door left ajar and had gone inside to check. When he saw the body of Emily Harris, he froze, unable to move or speak, as the grisly scene unfolded before him. The police arrived minutes later, their sirens cutting through the quiet morning like a knife. Officers rushed to the scene, securing the area and documenting every inch of the crime scene. Emily's body was found near the back of the library, her eyes wide open in an expression of sheer terror. She was slumped against the table, her textbooks scattered around her, some pages torn. There was no sign of struggle or theft. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, which made the situation even more baffling. Detective Clara Montgomery stepped into the library, her gaze immediately locking onto the gruesome sight. She had worked on countless murder cases, but there was something about this one that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The young woman had been killed in a place meant for quiet study, the symbol of safety and knowledge, now turned into a horrific crime scene. Clara couldn't ignore the image of Emily's wide, unblinking eyes, the expression of pure, unrelenting fear that haunted the very air in the room. Detective Montgomery, Officer Holt greeted her, his face grim as he stood beside her. It doesn't look like a robbery. No signs of forced entry. Nothing's been taken. Clara nodded slowly, taking in the surroundings. Any sign of the killer? No, Holt replied. The janitor says the door was unlocked, but no one saw anything unusual. No cameras in the library either. Typical, Clara muttered. Always the places that are supposed to be safe. In the hours that followed, the crime scene was thoroughly examined, but the investigators were left with more questions than answers. Forensics found no DNA at the scene other than Emily's, and no fingerprints were left behind. There were no signs of sexual assault, and her personal items remained untouched. Her phone, wallet, and backpack were all still in place. The absence of clear motive left everyone at the station uneasy. The autopsy report confirmed the initial shock of the crime scene. Emily had been brutally attacked, though the details were chillingly cold. She had been struck several times with a blunt object, likely a bookend or something heavy, directly to the head. The wounds were consistent with someone who had been overcome with a frenzy, with no attempt to steal or ransack the area. Her death had been instantaneous, with no chance to defend herself. It was hard to determine a time of death precisely, but the forensic pathologist estimated that she had died sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. Emily had been alone in the library, and it was clear from the signs of the attack that she hadn't had time to scream for help. Whoever had done this to her had been methodical, brutal, and above all, patient. As the investigation unfolded, the first person of interest was Jason Morgan. He was a student who had been seen in the library late that night, though he wasn't spotted near the scene of the crime itself. He had left the library by the time the janitor arrived, which raised immediate suspicion. Clara's team quickly pulled Jason's records. He had no criminal history, no violent tendencies in his background. He was a quiet student, but nothing about his demeanor screamed dangerous. However, Jason's peculiar behavior in the days after Emily's death began to raise red flags. Jason was questioned the morning following the discovery of Emily's body. He had shown up to class early, just like any other day, without missing a beat. When Detective Montgomery spoke with him, Jason's reactions were oddly detached. He seemed nervous, but there was something about his nervousness that felt rehearsed. He spoke calmly when asked about his whereabouts the previous evening, his answers always too perfect, too clear to be genuine. "I was at the library, like usual," Jason told Clara, his voice calm and unwavering. "I wasn't there when it happened, though. I left before the janitor found her." "You didn't see anyone else in the library?" Clara asked, her voice steady but sharp. Jason hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "No. I was just studying. I left around 11:30. I'm not sure when she was found." The lack of emotion in his voice, the absence of fear, seemed off. Most people would have been horrified, shaken. But Jason was eerily calm. Clara made a note to look deeper into his background. The investigators also learned that Jason had a history of isolating himself. He was a social outcast of sorts, known for keeping to himself and often slipping under the radar. But despite his odd social behavior, nothing in his history seemed to suggest that he was capable of the violence that had just taken place. As the investigation continued, Clara and her team began to dig deeper into Jason's life. They interviewed people who had known him, searched his dorm room, and analyzed his online activity. What they found disturbed them even more. Jason's search history revealed dark, disturbing things, articles about violent fantasies, about control, about the psychological pleasure of power. It wasn't just random. It was focused. Jason had been obsessing over violent power dynamics, slowly becoming consumed by his thoughts. But there was one detail that caught Clara's eye. A few weeks before Emily's murder, Jason had been seen near the library, watching her. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. He had no apparent reason to be near her. But now, with the murder fresh in everyone's minds, the pieces started to fit together in a way that made Clara sick to her stomach. Jason had been watching her for weeks, learning her habits, studying her. The more they pieced together Jason's movements, the clearer it became that Emily's death had not been a random act. It wasn't a crime of passion, nor was it a spur-of-the-moment killing. Jason had planned this. And as Clara stood over the pile of evidence, she realized just how meticulously he had laid out his plan. He had chosen Emily, watched her for weeks, perhaps even longer. And now, as he sat in his dorm room, trying to act normal, he was already looking ahead to his next move. What do you think? Was Jason involved in Emily's murder from the beginning, or was there something else at play? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're hooked on this case, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next part of the investigation. As Clara delved deeper into Jason's life, she began to realize that the case was more twisted than she had ever imagined. But the biggest shock was still to come. Jason wasn't acting alone. And his darkest secret was still hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Jason thought he had covered his tracks, but the walls are closing in. The truth is about to come out. It had been several days since Emily's body was discovered. The media had caught wind of the case, and now the campus was buzzing with fear and whispers. The police were closing in on Jason Morgan, but there was still no concrete evidence that could link him directly to Emily's murder. He remained cool, composed, too composed for someone who was supposed to be grieving the loss of a classmate. Jason's mind, however, was anything but composed. Every moment of every day since the murder, he could feel the walls closing in. The pressure was unbearable, and yet, he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Each day was a countdown. The fear of being caught gnawed at him, but it wasn't fear that drove him. It was the excitement. The thrill of having done something no one else could understand, something that put him in control in a way he'd never felt before. He had killed before. But this time was different. Jason had always been a quiet, isolated person. His friends were few, his interactions with others minimal. He liked it that way. People didn't ask questions when you didn't give them a reason to care. But he'd always been intrigued by power, the power to manipulate, to control, to make others bend to his will. When he first saw Emily, he had been drawn to her. She was innocent, bright, and oblivious to the darkness that surrounded her. But what drew him in the most was how easy it would be to make her his. And now, she was dead. Jason sat at his desk, staring at the small journal in front of him. It had been weeks since he'd started documenting his feelings, his thoughts, and his progress. He wrote in it every night, almost religiously. There was something cathartic about putting his thoughts down on paper. It allowed him to relive the events of that night, to remember the power he had felt as he took Emily's life. It had been so simple, too simple, really. He had gotten in, done the job, and walked away. But as the days passed, something inside of him was starting to change. The excitement was turning to something darker, something he couldn't name. His thoughts were becoming erratic, obsessive. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, about the way she had looked in her final moments. He remembered the way her eyes had widened with fear, the way her body had jerked when the first blow hit. He remembered the sound of her last breath. But it wasn't enough. Jason needed more. The investigation was moving forward. Detective Clara Montgomery had Jason in her sights. She could feel it. There was something off about him. He wasn't like the other suspects, those who acted out of panic, who left behind traces of themselves. No, Jason had planned this. He had executed it with chilling precision. But there was one thing she couldn't understand. Why had he done it? What was his motive? Clara spent hours at the precinct, going over Jason's past. He was a textbook case of someone who had kept everything buried beneath the surface. But every investigator knew that everyone had a breaking point, some small trigger that set off their darkest impulses. And the deeper Clara dug into Jason's life, the more she began to suspect that Emily was only the beginning. Jason had been obsessing over other students. Not just Emily. The more Clara read, the more she uncovered his disturbing pattern of stalking and manipulation. He had been lurking in the shadows of others' lives, watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Emily had just been his first victim. She wouldn't be the last. Jason knew they were closing in. He had become more paranoid, more anxious. He was finding it harder and harder to focus on his classes. The idea of being caught was constantly on his mind. He couldn't sleep. When he did sleep, he woke up in cold sweats, the sound of Emily's screams echoing in his head. But there was another feeling that was starting to take over. A feeling that twisted his gut and made his heart race faster than it ever had before. He wanted to do it again. The desire was overwhelming. He couldn't shake the need for control, for power. He thought about Emily's murder every day, how simple it had been, how easy it had felt. And now, with the investigation breathing down his neck, the urge to kill again had become something he couldn't ignore. Jason watched his classmates. He watched how they laughed, how they spoke, how they lived without fear. He couldn't understand it. How could they be so unaware? How could they go about their lives, acting like everything was normal, when he knew the truth? He had killed. He had taken life. And he was the only one who knew the real danger lurking on this campus. Late one evening, just as the library was beginning to empty, Jason saw her. A girl he had seen around campus, Sarah Turner, another student from his psychology class. She was alone, sitting at a table near the back of the library, working on her laptop. Jason's pulse quickened as he watched her from across the room. There was something about her that made his skin crawl with anticipation. She was so oblivious to the fact that she was being watched. She was a perfect target. This time, Jason didn't hesitate. He walked toward her, every step measured, controlled. He was calm, his hand steady as he approached the table. "Hey," he said softly, his voice almost sweet. "Sarah, right? I'm Jason. We're in the same class." Sarah looked up, a little surprised but not alarmed. She had seen Jason around, but she had never spoken to him before. He seemed like a nice enough guy, though a little quiet. "Yeah, I remember you," Sarah replied with a smile. "What's up?" "I was just wondering if you needed any help with the material for the exam," Jason said, his voice still smooth and calm. "I've been going over the readings, and I think I could help you with some of the concepts." Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing around the almost empty library. "I guess that would be helpful, yeah. Thanks, Jason." Jason smiled to himself. This is it. This is the moment. He knew exactly how to play it. He knew exactly how to get close to her, how to get her alone. He would follow the same pattern, slow, controlled, never rushing. He wouldn't make the same mistakes he made with Emily. No, this time, he would be smarter. As he sat down next to her, his heart raced. The calmness on the outside was a mask for the storm inside. His pulse was quickening, his breathing shallow. He felt a rush, a feeling of invincibility. And in that moment, as he leaned closer to Sarah, he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. What do you think? Is Jason about to strike again, or will the authorities catch him before it's too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on this chilling case. You won't want to miss what happens next. Jason's hunger for control and violence was growing stronger. But the walls were closing in on him, and it wouldn't be long before the truth came out. Could he escape the grasp of the law, or would his twisted desires be his undoing? Jason thought he had covered his tracks, but the walls are closing in. The truth is about to come out. Jason Morgan could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. Every step he took, every breath he drew, seemed to carry the burden of his past actions. His mind was no longer his own. The hunger to control, to kill, had grown unbearable, and though he tried to convince himself he was still in control, the reality was undeniable. He was spiraling. His nights were plagued with nightmares, visions of Emily's terror-stricken eyes staring back at him. Her screams echoed in his mind, their jagged edges cutting through his sleep. But even in the midst of this chaos, Jason could feel something else, a strange, exhilarating rush, the thrill of being so close to getting away with murder. The investigation had gone quiet. They hadn't found any physical evidence linking him to the crime. It seemed like he was untouchable. But deep down, Jason knew the truth. He was a ticking time bomb. Detective Clara Montgomery had spent days and nights chasing down leads, piecing together the fragmented evidence left behind by Emily's murder. She was certain Jason Morgan had something to do with it. Everything about him screamed guilt, his detachment, his calmness in the face of tragedy, the way he behaved when questioned. But there was still nothing concrete. No smoking gun. No physical evidence. Just a gut feeling, and Clara was a seasoned detective. She didn't let gut feelings guide her, she needed proof. However, as days passed and Jason continued to walk around campus without suspicion, Clara's own frustration grew. She couldn't shake the thought that Jason was getting away with it. Worse, there was a growing sense of inevitability in her stomach. She had seen this before. She had seen how killers like Jason operated. The calm facade. The act. The waiting. And then it hit her. She needed to dig deeper. Not into his actions, but into his mind. Clara called in a psychological profiler to help with the case. The profiler's analysis of Jason's behavior patterns confirmed her suspicions. Jason wasn't just detached, he was calculating. He had prepared for everything. He had planned the murder with meticulous care, and now he was living in the aftermath as though nothing had happened. His behavior wasn't the behavior of a person who was innocent. He was someone who had experienced the exhilaration of power and violence. And in his mind, Emily was just the first. The profiler noted that Jason's obsession with control and power could be tied to an emotional or psychological trigger, something that would explain his need to kill. His fascination with Emily had started as an obsession with her intellect. She was smart, driven, the kind of person he admired. But over time, Jason's admiration turned into something far more dangerous. He saw Emily as someone who represented everything he could never be. She was normal. She was popular. And that angered him. At the same time, Jason's behavior in the aftermath of the murder made sense. His detachment wasn't just a result of guilt, it was a result of how much pleasure he derived from the act. He had killed, and the power he had felt in that moment was something he couldn't walk away from. It consumed him, more and more with each passing day. By the end of the week, Jason's behavior was becoming more erratic. His classmates began to notice. He was no longer the quiet, reserved student they once knew. He was slipping. His anxiety was noticeable. He avoided looking people in the eye. His hands would tremble when he wrote notes or passed papers in class. The calm Jason had once exuded was disappearing, replaced by a nervous energy. But still, no one had connected the dots. He kept his distance, knowing better than to let anyone get too close. The worst part was that he could feel the detective watching him. He had seen Clara a few times, her sharp eyes never leaving him. It was as if she could see through his facade, cutting to the core of his being. The more Jason tried to act like nothing was wrong, the more he became aware of how much control she had over him. He was being hunted, and though he wasn't ready to admit it, a small part of him welcomed it. The rush. The fear. It only made him more certain that he was unstoppable. Jason needed another kill. Another victim. The thrill of the first murder was fading, and the thought of losing that high was unbearable. But what if Clara was getting too close? Jason's obsession with control had now turned to paranoia. He couldn't relax. He couldn't focus. The walls were closing in. His every move felt tracked. He couldn't trust anyone, not his classmates, not his professors, and certainly not the police. He needed to act. But the timing had to be perfect. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not again. His mind raced as he walked through the darkened halls of the campus, watching students talk and laugh, completely unaware of the horror that had touched their lives. He could still remember the look on Emily's face, frozen in fear. The sound of her last breath. The way he had felt power coursing through him as he took her life. The anticipation of it all. Jason turned a corner and nearly collided with someone. His heart skipped a beat. He looked up, only to see Sarah Turner standing in front of him, her face warm with a smile. "Hey, Jason," she greeted, her voice light. "I didn't expect to see you here. You okay? You've been acting, well, a little off lately." Jason froze. His thoughts raced. Sarah had been on his radar for a while. She had that same innocent, easygoing demeanor that Emily had. She was the perfect next target. But in that moment, something strange happened. He felt a flicker of something that wasn't just the need to control her or kill her. For the first time in a while, Jason hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, his voice coming out more strained than he intended. He forced a smile, a shaky, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just, been stressed with exams, you know?" Sarah looked at him curiously, but she didn't press the issue. "Well, I hope you're doing all right. If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Jason nodded, feeling a strange, unsettling pang of guilt. For a brief second, he felt human again, like someone who could be redeemed. But that feeling vanished as quickly as it came. He was too far gone. That night, Jason lay in his bed, his body thrumming with the aftereffects of the adrenaline coursing through him. He hadn't acted on his instincts with Sarah, but the urge to do so had never been stronger. He knew what was happening. He couldn't stop. And as he lay there in the dark, the truth began to settle in. The walls were closing in on him. The investigation wasn't going to stop. The police were getting closer. Clara was watching him. And if he didn't act soon, he would be trapped. Jason's breathing became shallow, his heart racing faster with every thought. He had to end this. But what if Clara was just waiting for him to slip up? Jason's descent into madness is starting to spiral out of control. Could his next victim be closer than we think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're hooked on this twisted story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. There's more to come, trust us, you won't want to miss it. Jason was nearing the end of his rope. Paranoia was consuming him, and the urge to kill again was almost unbearable. But in the end, it wouldn't be his actions that would catch up with him, it would be the truth. The truth that was about to be exposed in ways he never expected. The end was coming, and he wasn't ready for it. The trial of Jason Morgan is one of the most talked about cases in recent memory. The public demands answers. What could make a young man commit such unspeakable acts? Jason Morgan sat motionless in the holding cell, the cold concrete walls pressing in on him. The weight of the impending trial bore down on him like a physical presence. The brief moment of triumph he had once felt, walking free, untouchable, was gone. All that remained was the suffocating knowledge that his life, as he knew it, was over. The doors to his cell creaked open. Jason looked up. It was time. The trial had begun. The courtroom was packed, filled with spectators, journalists, and most importantly, the people who had been affected by Emily Harris's brutal death. Her family, her friends, and the entire campus seemed to be holding their breath. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. Everyone was waiting for justice. Jason sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his defense attorney. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He had rehearsed this moment over and over in his head, how he would appear, how he would act. He had been preparing for this, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of facing the world. His secret was out. His every move was under a microscope. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Anna Williams, stood up first. Her sharp voice echoed throughout the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today to seek justice for Emily Harris, a young woman whose life was stolen from her in the most horrific way imaginable. Jason Morgan, the defendant, is charged with the brutal murder of Ms. Harris. A murder that was planned, executed, and carried out with cold, calculated precision. Anna's gaze shifted toward Jason, her eyes filled with disdain. This was not a crime of passion. This was a deliberate act, committed by a young man who, by his own actions and words, showed no remorse. We will prove that Jason Morgan knew exactly what he was doing that night. And we will prove that he took pleasure in ending Emily's life. Jason's fingers tightened into fists under the table, but he kept his face expressionless. He had rehearsed this. He knew what they would say. They would paint him as a monster, but he wasn't a monster. He was in control. He was always in control. The prosecutor continued, laying out the evidence that connected Jason to the crime. They played the footage from the campus security cameras showing him entering and leaving the library, his face barely visible as he glanced around. The footage was grainy, but it was enough. Jason's presence in the library the night of Emily's death was undeniable. Anna Williams also highlighted his behavior in the days following the murder, his lack of grief, his strange calmness when questioned by police. How he had barely flinched at the news of Emily's death. The calmness of a predator who had already moved on to the next hunt. When it was his defense attorney's turn, Jason's lawyer, a seasoned criminal defense attorney named Charles Brackett, stood up with a confident, measured stride. His voice was calm, soothing even, as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have just heard from the prosecution paints a dark and terrible picture of my client. But we urge you not to make a judgment based on emotion alone. Yes, Jason Morgan was present in the library the night Emily Harris died. Yes, there is a clear timeline that implicates him. But there is one thing the prosecution has failed to prove: motive. Charles turned toward Jason, placing a hand on his shoulder, as though to offer reassurance. Jason Morgan is not a monster. He is not a heartless killer. He is a young man who suffered from profound psychological issues that, sadly, were never addressed. He is a victim of his own mind. A mind that was torn apart by his obsessive thoughts. A mind that, in his darkest moments, took him to a place where his actions were no longer his own. The defense argued that Jason was not mentally fit to stand trial, citing his history of isolation, his difficulty forming meaningful connections with others, and his troubled upbringing. They suggested that Jason's psychological state had been deteriorating for years, and that he had snapped in a moment of delusion, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of his actions. The courtroom grew heavy with emotion as witnesses were called to testify. Emily's parents, her mother and father, took the stand. Their grief was raw, a deep, searing sorrow that resonated with everyone in the room. They spoke about their daughter, a bright, promising young woman whose future had been cut short. Emily's mother sobbed uncontrollably as she described how she would never hear her daughter's laugh again, how she would never be able to see her grow into the person she was meant to be. Jason couldn't look at them. He couldn't bear it. Their pain was like a weight pressing on his chest, suffocating him. He had stolen their daughter from them, and now he was forced to face the consequences. He had always felt disconnected from emotions, from human suffering. But as the parents spoke about Emily's life, about her kindness, about her future, something inside of him stirred. For the briefest moment, he felt something that might have been regret. But it was fleeting, drowned by the dark, insatiable hunger that still simmered inside him. Then came the testimony from the psychologist, Dr. Rachel Carmichael, who had been called in to evaluate Jason's mental state. Dr. Carmichael's testimony was crucial, as the defense sought to prove that Jason's mental health issues played a central role in the murder. Dr. Carmichael explained how Jason's deep psychological issues had led him to fantasize about violence and control. She spoke of the obsessive thoughts he had documented in journals, the way he had fixated on Emily, how he had planned her murder not as a spur-of-the-moment act, but as a deliberate culmination of his deep-seated need for control. She also explained that while Jason was aware of his actions, his mental state had prevented him from fully understanding the consequences. The defendant is not a cold-blooded killer, Dr. Carmichael stated, her voice steady. But he is someone who was deeply disturbed. His obsession with violence was a symptom of a deeper psychological issue, one that was never addressed until it became too late. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides made their final arguments. The prosecution presented Jason as a cold, calculating murderer, someone who had carefully planned and executed Emily's death. They argued that his actions were not those of a person who was mentally ill, but of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They painted him as a predator who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. In contrast, the defense painted Jason as a victim of his own mind, someone who had been driven to madness by his unaddressed psychological issues. They pleaded with the jury to consider his troubled past and the mental illness that had ultimately led to the murder. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell silent. The weight of the decision before them was immense. Would they convict Jason of murder, or would they believe that his mental illness had played a significant role in his actions? Hours passed before the jury returned, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jason sat quietly, his eyes fixed ahead, not knowing what to expect. His lawyer gave his shoulder a reassuring pat, but it did little to calm him. The foreman of the jury stood up, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Morgan, guilty of first-degree murder. The words were like a slap to Jason's face. He had expected it, but hearing them aloud felt like a final verdict on his life. His stomach churned, and his throat tightened as he tried to maintain composure. Jason was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted into mixed reactions: relief, anger, and sorrow. Emily's family was emotional, but there was a sense of justice in their hearts. Jason's fate had been sealed, and for them, it brought some small measure of peace. As Jason was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs, he felt a strange sense of detachment. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't nervous. He had expected this. This was the inevitable outcome of his actions, and as he was taken to the holding cell, he realized something chilling. The monster that had taken Emily's life was still inside him. He might be locked away, but the hunger would never be truly gone. What do you think? Did the jury make the right decision? Was Jason a victim of his mental illness, or was he simply a cold-blooded killer? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Though Jason's story had come to an end in the courtroom, the ripples of his actions would continue to reverberate. The final question remained: could the truth ever be fully understood? Was Jason truly beyond redemption, or was he just a product of a broken mind? The answers would never be easy. The case is closed, but the consequences of Jason's actions will haunt everyone involved for years to come. The sound of the heavy prison doors slamming shut echoed through the narrow hallway, a sound that would now define Jason Morgan's existence. The guards led him down the long corridor, his footsteps hollow against the concrete floor. Every movement felt like a ritual, each second heavier than the last. Jason had been convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never see the outside world again. But as the cold steel doors of his new home were locked behind him, Jason wasn't thinking about his fate. He wasn't thinking about the years ahead, the isolation, or the years of monotony in a maximum security cell. What he was thinking about, what he always thought about, was the hunger. The relentless hunger inside him, the thirst for control, for the rush that came with taking a life. Jason's new cell was small, sterile, and suffocating. The walls were bare except for a small metal sink, a toilet, and a narrow bed. The window, if it could be called that, was a tiny slit high up in the concrete wall, just big enough to let in a sliver of daylight. It was the kind of place that drained you slowly, day by day, until you could no longer remember what life was like before you were confined to its walls. Jason stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the ceiling. This was it. This was his life now. No more freedom, no more control, no more exhilaration. Just the gray monotony of prison life, the endless days marked only by the sound of clanging metal gates, the murmur of distant voices, and the occasional shuffle of guards walking past his cell. For the first time in his life, Jason felt a profound emptiness, a quiet, suffocating void. But the hunger was still there. It gnawed at him, just beneath the surface, always waiting. And though he couldn't understand it, he knew it wouldn't go away. His life had changed, yes, but the darkness inside him hadn't. It was still there, and it was still a part of him. Outside the prison walls, Emily's death continued to ripple through the lives of those she had left behind. Her family, though grateful for the conviction, were never going to be the same. The pain of losing their daughter, their sister, was something that could never be healed. Emily had been a bright light in their lives, a source of joy and hope for the future. And then she was gone, taken from them in the most brutal, senseless way. Emily's mother, Jennifer Harris, spoke publicly about her daughter's legacy. Through tears, she shared her pain and sorrow, but also her hope that Emily's story would serve as a warning, a call to action for anyone who felt the darkness within themselves. Emily was taken from us, Jennifer said in an emotional interview. But we will not let her death be in vain. We will remember her, and we will fight for the people who didn't get to live the life she should have had. Jennifer's words resonated with many. Emily had been the victim of a predator, but through the tragedy, her family became advocates for mental health awareness and for recognizing the signs of people who might be at risk of harming others. Emily's story became a symbol of the importance of intervention, of understanding that the pain and darkness in people's minds could often be invisible, but no less dangerous. As days turned into weeks, Jason tried to adjust to life in prison. He had been placed in solitary confinement for his own safety. His name had become infamous across the prison system. The guard, the janitor, the prisoners, they all knew his story. He was the guy who killed the pretty girl on campus, the one who had stalked her for weeks before ending her life in cold blood. And no one wanted to be near him. No one wanted to even look at him. Jason didn't mind. He preferred the silence, the solitude. It was all he had now. But it wasn't enough. Every night, he lay in his bed, staring at the gray walls, the hunger inside him clawing at the edges of his mind. He remembered Emily's face, the look of pure terror before she died. He remembered the rush of power, the exhilaration of taking her life. It had been intoxicating, and the more he thought about it, the more he wanted it again. But he knew it was over. There would be no more victims. No more chances to control someone else. He was trapped physically, mentally, and emotionally. There would be no more moments of supremacy. No more thrills. Just the long, agonizing years in a cell where the only thing left to do was reflect on what he had done. And yet, despite everything, despite the conviction, the trial, the judgment, Jason could never bring himself to truly regret his actions. He couldn't. Because to him, the act of murder had been the one moment of his life where he had felt fully alive. It was the one thing that had given him control. And now, even in prison, it was the only thing that made sense to him. Detective Clara Montgomery had always known that Jason was a monster. But the more she uncovered about him, the more her heart ached for the human being behind the crime. She had spent weeks poring over Jason's life, trying to understand what had driven him to take Emily's life. It was clear that Jason had been struggling with something far deeper than just a thirst for power. His disturbed thoughts, his obsession with control, it was all rooted in something tragic. But understanding it didn't excuse it. Clara couldn't help but think about the way Jason had acted during the trial, how he had been so calm, so detached. It was like he had never truly understood the consequences of his actions. The loss he had caused. The grief. And yet, despite everything, he still didn't seem to feel the weight of his crimes. Even now, in prison, it seemed as though Jason's soul was hollow. And Clara couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he was just a product of a broken system, of a system that had failed him long before he ever picked up the weapon that took Emily's life. But Clara wasn't about to make excuses for him. Jason was where he belonged. He had taken a life, and he would never be free again. The justice system had done its job, but for Clara, the case was far from over. She had seen the depths of Jason's darkness, and she had vowed to herself that she would continue to fight for the victims of people like him. Jason spent the rest of his life in prison, isolated and alone. He had become a ghost in the system, someone who was forgotten by all but those who had been touched by his crime. He would never be able to undo the damage he had caused, and the hunger that had driven him to kill would remain with him for the rest of his life. But in the end, Jason Morgan was just another sad, tragic figure, a young man whose darkness had consumed him, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. For Emily's family, her friends, and the entire campus community, Jason's conviction was not the end of their pain. It wasn't even a resolution. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes, it's hidden in plain sight. But Emily's legacy, her memory, would live on. Her story would continue to inspire, to push others to make a difference. And for Clara Montgomery, the case was a reminder that justice was not always as simple as it seemed. She had solved the case. She had caught the killer. But there was no victory in this. There was only the bitter reality that sometimes, the monsters we face aren't always the ones we expect. Sometimes, they're the ones we never saw coming. The truth behind Jason's actions will continue to haunt the community and those who tried to stop him. But what do you think? Can people like Jason ever be rehabilitated? What should the punishment for someone like him be? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to stay updated on more true crime stories. We'll see you next time.